Hey guys, welcome to the vlog. My name is MisterET, and in today's episode we reinstall the clutch, the flywheel, the pressure plate, and the transmission on the engine that's going back in. And we do final prep to prepare the engine to go back into the engine bay, so stay tuned. So as you can see from our last video, we've cleaned up the inside of this transmission so there's no more shavings or anything like that anywhere. This bearing here is still good. We checked it, it was fine. And then we also looked at I believe it's the rear main seal in the back here, and that looked fine as well. So I've got the flywheel reinstalled on here with a couple bolts, and anytime you're reinstalling this on a car, you always want to make sure that you use a bit of red Loctite on these bolt threads so that these bolts do not back out of this. It's not a good time if that happens, and you don't want to go back into the transmission if you don't need to. So the first part is reinstalling those, and then after we're done with that, we'll have to reinstall this clutch. As you can see, these flywheel bolts take quite a bit of torque, so what we ended up doing here is doing it in 3 different passes. So I went 50 foot-pounds, I went 75, and then I went 115 on the last one. And I have this wonderful flywheel holder tool here that allows me to do that, but if you don't do that, if you don't have that, you need to find a way to hold your flywheel in place when you're doing this, because the last pass, and I've never seen flywheel bolts being torqued quite this high, so I was almost afraid of breaking them, but basically that is now installed. So the next step here, as you can see, there's a bit of schmutz on this flywheel. So before installing any sort of clutch or anything like that, you want to make sure that this surface is nice, it's clean, it's dry. So we're going to put some great brake cleaner on there, and we're going to clean this up a little bit. When you're reinstalling a clutch, you always want to have one of these tools here, so you're able to slide this in to the back of the flywheel this way, and it holds it there, and then the clutch basically rides on this piece, and it helps you align everything so you can bolt it down. Now, this actually comes from a Honda, and it doesn't have the right pattern or the right thickness. So if I try to fit this on here, as you can see, it's a bit loose. So one of the tricks that I've had over the years, when I have one of these, as long as this piece here fits snugly, you're fine. On the threads here, what you want to do to make it work is we're going to use a bit of duct tape. We're going to put a few rolls around, and we'll make sure that this here is snug with the clutch so that there is no more movement and it can be held up in there. This is a really nice little nifty trick that I learned over the years, so you don't end up having to purchase 15 of these, because from one car to another and from one brand to another, these are different. So here's what that looks like with our duct tape on there. So as you can see, this is nice and sturdy, will not fall out or anything like that. And then we're able to get this to go back on. So we've got something that's nice and secure, and then we're going to be able to reinstall the pressure plate. So when you're doing this install, make sure that the tool is all the way in during the full install. Make sure that you do it in a crisscross pattern, and make sure that you do it over multiple stages. So you're basically making sure that the bolts go in on a very, very slow, because there's a spring mechanism all the way around. So at least two stages to make this work. And final thing here I don't know if you guys can see this. I actually installed it upside down the first time. You got to make sure that the clutch says transmission side on this side over here, because your transmission actually goes over here. So that's a very, very important step. So now that everything here is cleaned up and reinstalled on the engine that's going back in, what we have to do now is actually install the transmission. But before we do that, I've decided that I'm going to be removing and changing this release bearing here. I don't know if this is normal, but I find that it's quite noisy and I can hear the little marbles in the bearing there. So better safe than sorry. This is really difficult to uninstall once you've got everything back in there, and it's very easy to do right now. So I'm going to be actually just removing this piece here and installing a new one, and then I will be able to put this back in. So we'll see you guys probably in a few days once we get this part here, and then we can just finalize this install. So guys, good news. I finally received the piece that I was missing. This is the release bearing inside the transmission. And this one was probably still reusable, but when you open up a transmission and you have pieces like that you can replace very easily, and they're rare items in a transmission, you should probably always look at changing those. In this case here, the way this works, you can probably hear it. Feels like you can hear the bearings inside, so there's some looseness to it that I don't like so much. And when I look at this new piece here, everything runs smoothly. There's no noises or anything like that. So I'm guessing that's probably a good thing that we changed it out. I'm hoping this fits properly because it's the same brand, and on autopartsway.ca where I purchased this piece, and by the way, it was about $50 cheaper than buying it at the dealership, and it took about 3 days to get here. They said this was compatible for 2013 Mazdaspeed3, but as you can see, the design is clearly different. When I look at the back of it here, the size of the hole and everything, it all looks to be pretty similar, so I'm hoping the piece will work as well. So let's go have a look. So anytime you're doing something like this inside of a manual transmission, there's a few points that are grease points. So you should grease the end of the shaft here, as well as these pieces where this release bearing will ride on. So I've got some lithium grease that I'm going to be applying here. I'm going to try and fit this back on there. So let's roll the time lapse. So now here comes the fun part. Now that the release bearing is back in the transmission and everything is bolted back to the engine, we now have to mate the transmission with the engine. There's always a little bit of wiggle. There's always a little bit of finicking around to get everything to fit. So let's again go on a time lapse of me mating the two surfaces together. We have most of the top bolts in place and the transmission is mated to the engine. We still have a few bolts to install underneath the engine. So these top bolts are enough to support the transmission here, and they will give me access to the underside of the transmission so I can tighten up these bolts. Let's finish this up. And so now everything is reinstalled on the transmission. So we've tightened up all the bolts around the housing to make sure they were even. We've reinstalled the slave cylinder, master or slave cylinder, and can never remember which one. And we've also reinstalled the starter right there. So this is pretty much buttoned up, and we'll now be able to reinstall the engine back into this wonderful engine bay. guys, after a bunch of wrestling with this engine off camera with my wife to help me reposition everything, as you can see behind me, this is finally back in. So let's have a look. So really, as you can see, this engine mount over here is back in. The engine mount on the other side is back in as well. And now all we have to do is really everything else. So that's going to do it for this video today, where we've now reinstalled the engine back into the Mazdaspeed3, and in our next video we start buttoning up everything. So thank you for listening in until the end. If you haven't done so already, hit that like button, subscribe, turn on post notifications, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video.